Hello everyone, and welcome to Lab Manager's Tech Trends webinar series. My name is Trevor Henderson, Technology Editor for Lab Manager, and I'll be moderating today's discussion, which will focus on tackling sample preparation for mass spectrometry. Today we have a panel consisting of 4 experts in the field who will discuss some of the latest trends and improvements in sample prep. We like our webinars to be very interactive, so we encourage you to send your questions at any point during the webinar, and our panelists will address these during the question and answer session following the presentation. Zoe Grosser. Zoe is a global marketing manager for Horizon. Trained as a chemist, Zoe has a deep experience in the analytical instrument industry in a number of markets, including environmental, food, and forensics. Welcome, Zoe.
Thank you very much, Trevor, and thanks for having me as a panelist. I'm excited to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the sample prep step in the analytical process. You can see that the analytical process considers both sample collection, sample preparation, instrumental analysis, and data handling. And we hear a lot about the instrumental analysis portion of this process and the data handling. But the sample preparation can actually contribute, and Daniel mentioned this, up to 20% in the total analysis variability. So the sample prep step is pretty important. Now the sample prep generally consists of several steps: extraction of the sample, perhaps a cleanup step to remove interferences. If water is present in the extract, drying may be necessary, and then evaporation or concentration to bring the sample down to a concentration volume that will give you the best sensitivity in order to make the decision you're looking to make with your instrumental analysis. I'll speak just a minute about Horizon technology. Horizon is dedicated to sample preparation. We have products that work on the solid phase extraction automation part of the analysis of the sample preparation. We also have techniques for drying, concentration, and solvent recovery that can work with liquid-liquid extraction or with solid phase extraction, all in helping you to get to the analytical step a little bit more efficiently. Our latest introduction is the ExcelVap Evaporation and Concentration System, which we just recently introduced into the market. Now, automation, in some cases, requires some new thinking. People are used to doing sample preparation in a manual way, and automation is a new way that requires them to think a little differently. It requires an investment in sample preparation, which is sometimes an overlooked area of the laboratory. Most importantly, it can provide more consistent analytical results and fewer reruns, which of course will help to increase productivity and profit. It can reduce solvent usage, which is becoming increasingly of concern in today's laboratory, and improve technician safety and reduce exposure to solvents. Now, Jason did a nice job of explaining how SPE works, so I'm just going to talk about a little bit of the comparison with liquid-liquid extraction, which is the conventional technique which has been often used for extraction of samples in many markets. By comparison, solid phase extraction can be up to 50 times more efficient than liquid-liquid extraction and continuous liquid-liquid extraction. There are many SPE phases to choose from. SPE's been around for probably 40 to 50 years. And in that time, a lot of progress has been made. Certainly at the very beginning, back in the 70s, 1970s, there were a lot of things that were tried that didn't work as well as what you would find today. In fact, Corey Kelly from Phenomenex did a great talk at the National Environmental Monitoring Conference talking about the changes in solid phase extraction and the development of new chemistries and new materials that have really made it a very versatile and useful technique now compared to the early days. It yields quantitative extractions and, most importantly, no emulsions, which you can find happen when you do a liquid-liquid extraction. Reduces solvent use and labor time and it's more easily automated. And I think this is a key factor, and we'll talk about that going forward. Solid phase extraction is established in some markets, and we heard from the other speakers today that in the pharmaceutical market especially, you see a lot of use of solid phase extraction. And it's established in some parts of the world, and I think Europe is ahead of the U.S. in this regard. Now, it can be used in disc or cartridge format. And next you'll see the SpeedX 4790, which is a product Horizon Technology has developed to automate disc solid phase extraction, and then the SmartPrep cartridge extractor, which can be used with 1, 3, or 6 mil cartridges from any manufacturer. Next, we'll go through an example, and I chose an environmental example in this case, an EPA method 8270, which is an acid-base neutral extraction for a very challenging large suite of semi-volatile organic compounds. We'll talk a little bit about whether it is compliant with accepted methodology, show that it provides an analytical advantage, and discuss the business advantage. In terms of SPE being accepted into environmental methods in the United States, certainly there are a huge variety of drinking water methods that refer to SPE right within the method. And in fact, there's one method, 525.3, which actually is devoted to solid phase extraction. And this second slide shows in this table even more methods in the drinking water program that refer to SPE. Now, in terms of solid waste, the Office of Solid Waste, most of their methodology is guidance only, and any time that you can meet the quality control criteria and meet the data objectives, then your technique would be allowed. And solid phase extraction, we have demonstrated, certainly fits with that. Now, on your resource tab, there is a method, an application note showing method 8270 in detail. So what we talk about here is just an overview, but you can look at that application note for the details on the performance. Now, we are working with the EPA on wastewater methods, specifically EPA 625, which is a wastewater method similar to 8270, which has a very large suite of analytes. This slide shows some of the development efforts by Horizon. Horizon's been around for 20 years, and we have continued to advance the technology and chemistry of solid phase extraction. We also have been looking at a variety of analytes and working to ensure that the technology keeps up with the analytes that are of interest in the different markets. We've worked on a disc, which I think is pretty cool. This disc includes 3 different mechanisms for analyte retention. So there is a lot that you can do going forward even in terms of the chemistries for these discs and cartridges. It's really quite an elegant solution for 8270, and we'll show here how now you can do method 8270 with a 1 liter sample of liquid and 1 pass through the disc, through a carbon cartridge, and out to waste. So instead of having to basify your sample and do a second pass through the disc, you just do 1 pass, then you can do 3 elutions. You elute the disc with solvent, you elute the disc again with basified solvent, and then you elute the carbon cartridge. And that's if you want to improve your light and process, or you could leave the carbon cartridge out. Now, this shows the recoveries of a large suite of compounds with a traditional approach. Here, liquid-liquid extraction has been used, sodium sulfate drying, and an evaporation down to the volume of 1 milliliter. And you can see that the recoveries are all over the place. Some of the light end compounds are not retained. You can see that some of the bad actors later in the recovery list. So there are some problems with the traditional approach. When you do the 1-pass disc extraction using the carbon cartridge, you get much better recoveries. And you can see that within the range that is accepted for the methodology, you have very good recovery. Now we've divided it up here. The pH 2 solution is in red. The ion exchange portion, which is what would have been the basified compounds, are in blue. And then the carbon cartridge is in black. And you would do all those in the same run, but here we've separated them so that you can see where the improvements come. So to conclude, advances in automation can help to provide a more reproducible sample preparation step and can add efficiency to production laboratories. Solid phase extraction has become more well-known and well-characterized, allowing its use in a variety of methods. Recent developments in solid phase adsorption sorbents, chemistries, and accessories have extended the range of environmental samples that can be processed via SPE discs and can include the most challenging water samples. We didn't even talk about how messy those samples can become and how you can get them through a disc very efficiently with the modern technology that Horizon can provide. Both disc and cartridge approaches can be used with automation, and their choice depends on the requirements of the laboratory in terms of the size of the sample. Is it 1 liter? Is it 10 milliliters? The number of samples that need to be measured, and the particulate content. The first thing is that you have to get the sample to flow in order for solid phase extraction to be useful. So there is a lot of use here. We have talked and we're able to show that we were compliant with accepted methodology in our example, that we have an analytical advantage in our recoveries, and we have a business advantage in terms of speed, the amount of solvent, and everything else that would be required. So that's the end of my presentation. My contact information is here. We have resources on the resource site, and I turn it back over to Trevor for the question and answer session.
Thanks very much, Zoe, and again, thank you to all our presenters today. I think we'll go straight into our question and answer session. We have a number of questions that have come in from the audience. Firstly, are there any specific situations where a disc versus a cartridge system would be more advantageous?
I'd like to answer that question. For larger samples, such as a liter, a disc is going to be much faster than a cartridge. In addition, if your sample has a lot of stuff in it, some samples are pretty disgusting, water samples that have sediment or sludge, and a disc will handle that much better than a cartridge.
It was mentioned that the method utilized very small sample volumes. Do you see this as being a current trend for sample prep? And how is that affecting the approaches taken?
Yeah, this is Jonathan. I'd just like to add that with respect to some of the food and water samples, smaller samples can be advantageous to save on things such as shipping costs as well as storage of the samples. If you can go from a 1 liter bottle down to a 10 milliliter vial, you need a lot less room to store those samples in your laboratory until you can run them. And at the same time, it's a lot cheaper to FedEx smaller volumes than it is large bottles. So that's another consideration.
I think that the EPA is moving in that direction as well. Certainly in some of the methodology that they have written, they have talked about using less than 1,000 mils, something like 250 mils for an automatic sampler, 40 mils for headspace. So I think there is some movement in that direction in the environmental market too.
You mentioned the EPA there. Has the EPA accepted SPE for wastewater analysis, do you know?
We actually have been working with the EPA on that, and they're in the process of creating a small round robin to gather some data on method 625 using SPE techniques from a variety of vendors. So they would like to include it, but because it is a regulated community that's very strong, I think they need to have a lot of information to support their position.
One of the questions I always come back to is cost justification. It's an important issue for a lot of lab managers. How do you really measure return on investment when it comes to sample preparation?
This is Jonathan. I can answer that. We do have some, I'm sure the other vendors as well have some calculations that can be done, spreadsheet type calculators where you can take the cost of your various inputs, things like how much your labor cost is, how much you're paying for solvent, the number of samples you're running, and time, things like that. And it can give you a report back on how much time it would take in your laboratory to recoup the additional investment cost of the automated techniques. And in most cases, it's quite surprising when the customer actually inputs all those values accurately and they see, oh wow, I can actually pay for this thing in less than a year, for example. Even though the cost of these, some of these techniques are quite expensive up front, you just can see it on paper that you are saving that money by going to these automated techniques.
I think that's a very good point. I think that when you've got something that can run overnight, unattended, your technicians can be repurposed. You don't have reruns because you've had problems with liquid extraction. I think all of those things can factor into those calculations.
And we've seen this where a customer takes a chance on one of these techniques and the new technology, and then they end up buying more than one because they do see that it does give that enhancement in their productivity for all the reasons Zoe just mentioned as well.
Great, thanks very much. How do you handle samples with high viscosities? Our listener suggests it would work for milk samples, but not for honey or egg samples.
Yeah, our turbo flow this is Jonathan again from Thermo. We have analyzed honey samples with our turbo flow technology that I spoke of earlier. And typically that requires some sort of dilution, either with solvent or water, depending on what your sample is. But other than that, it can take some fairly viscous samples. Honey is probably a good example because it is pretty thick, but we can dilute that down before we inject it onto the automated system. So I'll see if anybody else has any more on that.
This is Jason. Yeah, generally it's, dilution is the way to go, but there's also, you may do a multi-step where you do a liquid-liquid extraction with, say, a strong organic solvent, and then follow that up with a solid phase extraction to clean that up. And so, but in general, I think dilution is the most common way to deal with the viscous samples.
What will drive future sample prep development? Do you sort of predict revolutionary new ideas, or are we just going to see incremental improvements going forward?
Trevor, that's a very good question. I can see there being some incremental changes. SPE's been around for such a long time, and there hasn't been any revolutionary change. I think it's been very much incremental. I can see on the horizon some, let's say, new chemistry being made available, which I think would essentially be more chromatographic rather than, more reverse phase rather than, let's say, normal or stationary phase. Really, the way the market, and from my experience, the way that these products are being derived is really to reduce the time it takes to inject the extracted sample, as well as maintaining a lot more of the same performance levels, but just meaning that things are prepared quicker. And again, throughput for a lot of laboratories these days is everything.
The ideal situation is that you bring your sample to the lab, you dump it into the black box, and the answer comes out the other end. So I know that we still have a ways to go. It's just not always clear exactly what the pathway is to get there.
Yeah, it could be a very small black box or a very big black box. But because it's black, nobody knows.
Well, I think that if no one else has anything more to add, I think it's going to bring us to the end of today's webinar.